Israel's war on Gaza has been put on hold for another day after the temporary ceasefire negotiated between Hamas and the IDF was extended another 24 hours overnight. 16 more hostages kidnapped on October 7th were released by Hamas, including another American citizen. The IDF is currently investigating Hamas's claims that the youngest hostage from October 7th, 10-month-old Kafir Bibas, and his mother and 4-year-old brother are dead as a result of an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. In a statement, the IDF has said Hamas is responsible for the safety of its hostages.
Meanwhile, a Palestinian teenager and 8-year-old boy were shot and killed by Israeli forces conducting a raid in the West Bank. The IDF claims the boys were throwing explosives. Here's the deputy mayor of Jerusalem being questioned on the matter.
We're talking about the release of attempted murderers. You call them children, but we're talking about teenagers who stabbed other teenagers. We're talking about...
That's not my question, Deputy Mayor. I totally and fully understand that they have been accused.
I'm giving you the context.
I understand, but if I can, Deputy Mayor, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm fully aware of...
I'm answering the
Deputy
question.
Mayor, I'm fully aware of what they've been...
Part of the deal was that there would be no celebrations. And the reason that these clashes are occurring is because exactly against the deal that there would be no celebrations celebrating the release of attempted murderers.
Joining us now to weigh in is Executive Director at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi. Dr. Parsi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Were you surprised to hear that the ceasefire was extended after these claims on both sides that, the IDF is accused of shooting these individuals that they claim are terrorists? Hamas was involved in a shooting that killed 3 and injured 6 in Israel, and yet we have another 24-hour extension of the ceasefire.
No, I wasn't surprised because one of the fears that the Netanyahu government had about a prisoner exchange was that it would boost the pressure in Israel itself for the Israeli government to prioritize prisoner exchanges over the bombardment of Gaza. Up until the swap, the priority clearly was to go and bomb Gaza rather than really prioritizing the prisoner exchanges. Now, when so many of them have been released, there's proof of concept. There was an expectation that it would galvanize the pressure on the government to really prioritize the prisoner exchanges and see those truces and swaps extended. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing that happening at this stage. The question is, will it change the thinking or force to change the thinking of the Netanyahu government in a deeper way that would prompt it not to continue the warfare in southern Gaza after all of the hostages have been released?
I mean, that's an important point you're alluding to there. I mean, wasn't it the case that the Hamas offered a prisoner exchange weeks ago before thousands of additional civilians had been killed, but it had been rejected? The implication of that is that exactly what you're saying, that there was a priority to go ahead and have perhaps an ability or justification or rationale for a continued siege in lieu of actually getting back the hostages that have been having to endure as hostages in Gaza.
Absolutely. I mean, it was very clear that the real priority of the Israeli government was not to go and rescue the hostages, but to go after Hamas and Gaza as a whole. And so this prisoner swap was actually on the table for quite some time. And it was the Netanyahu government that refused to sign it because of their own issues. And as you saw, it took about 7 hours of deliberations inside the coalition government before the government finally gave a yes to this deal. And there was a lot of resistance from some of the more far-right groups in the government who didn't want this in the first place. And again, part of the concern was that once you actually have swaps, the momentum will be so strong that going back to warfare might be more difficult. And that's something that some of the elements in the Israeli government didn't want to give up on. And as Politico has reported as well, similarly, there were concerns in the Biden administration that once there would be a pause in the fighting or a pause in the bombing, more reporters would be able to go in and actually see what had happened in Gaza, and those images would be terrible as they were, and that will further galvanize public and global opinion to put a stop to this war permanently.
I want to go back to the clip that we played at the beginning, where there was discussion of this incident that happened where a released Palestinian hostage went home and was shot. And the Israeli official that we were just listening to was saying that seemed to be arguing that it was justified on the basis that they had imposed a rule that there could be no celebrating the release of those Palestinian prisoners in East Jerusalem. Therefore, it was, I suppose, justified to go ahead and shoot at alleged celebrants. Can you unpack what's going on there? Why is it that there is the possibility of creating these kind of edicts by Israel on Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem? And is that indicative of the kind of lifestyle that Palestinians are used to living in the area?
Well, I mean, first of all, we can say that increasingly the Israeli government is not caring about any international norms whatsoever and is not being pressured to care about them, at least not pressured enough. So to go on an interview and justify the shooting of a former prisoner because they violated apparent rule of no celebrations, and seeing that as a really strong argument tells you how far they have gone in a direction that makes them diverge from the rest of the world, including the United States, I would say. On the issue of the celebrations, I think that's also very important. I think what we're seeing Israel's conduct being right now is very much driven by the specific concerns of the most hardline elements in that government. And what they were afraid of was that a prisoner swap would be seen and would be perceived as a victory for Hamas. And as a result, they wanted to make sure that there were no celebrations or images of that. And apparently going as far as shooting a former prisoner for having violated that apparent rule of the swap. But that tells you something of where this is. This is more about appearances than really what's happening on the ground, and that's extremely dangerous.
Now, Dr. Parsi, President Biden has firmly come out against conditioning humanitarian aid to Israel, despite previously quipping that the idea was worthwhile. This as a former Israeli PM, Naftali Bennett, told Jake Tapper that the IDF's plans are to totally disarm and to, quote, denazify Gaza after the war.
Israel would retain overall security and defense responsibility, but we don't want to govern the Gazans. So what I think we would do is create an interim technocratic self-government that would say for about 5 years govern Gaza, denazify Gaza, which means clean out all the incitement, all the education that all Jews are pigs and devils. And after 5 years, we would revisit and figure out how to create a sustainable government.
Yeah, and this is the language that also Putin was using in Ukraine. And we remember how people in Washington reacted to that when the word and the term denazification was being used. I think we're seeing a clear pattern here in which the administration puts forward some very limited pressures, tries to make a big deal out of it in the American press, and the Israelis, by and large, completely ignore those pressures. And it's not working. The idea that this is the approach to actually be able to hold Israel accountable is clearly not working, because when it comes to actually doing the real things that would matter, which such as conditioning aid or actually having consequences when the Israelis are not abiding by what the United States is saying, there we see that the Biden administration is not willing to put forward any real pressure. And as a result, this conflict has gone on more than 50 days now. It likely will continue again at some point, despite the fact that the Biden administration has said that they don't want to see Israel governing Gaza, they don't want to see any territorial changes. Certainly, that is not something that the Israelis indicate that they have agreed to. In fact, Netanyahu is openly bragging that the main strength he has is that he's the one that can prevent a Palestinian state from being created. So while the Biden administration talks about how it's pursuing a two-state solution, which it's not, and saying that the Netanyahu government is a partner in that, well, according to the Netanyahu government, they're not a partner in that, because they're explicitly saying that they're going to try to prevent a two-state solution, which is exactly what they have been doing for the last 10 plus years.
What is the role of the Hamas leader in Gaza saying the leaders of the occupation should know October 7th was just a rehearsal? What is that role does that play into this conflict now and Israel's response to what's been happening? I mean, I can't imagine how that would potentially lead to reducing the inflamed tensions?
Certainly not. It's an inflammatory language. It certainly doesn't help any form of de-escalation. It plays into the Israeli argument that all of these different ceasefires or pauses are actually going to only help Hamas regroup and launch new attacks, etc. But it's clearly that he's playing to a completely different audience, an audience that sees these attacks as having fundamentally changed the Israeli-Palestinian equation, because prior to this, there was no equation. The Palestinians were not there at all. We saw how the United States was pursuing the Abraham Accords under Trump, and then under the Biden administration, they doubled down on it. And a critical component and a fundamental assumption of that was that the Palestinians simply didn't matter any longer. So the focus should be to try to integrate Israel into the economic structures of the Middle East and the political and security structures of the Middle East without solving the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because it simply wasn't that relevant any longer. What we've seen over the course of the last 50 days, of course, that has fundamentally changed. And anyone who is under the illusion that we can go back to the previous formula and just ignoring the Palestinian issue should not be in power, in my view, because it's clear that approach, unfortunately, contributed to the very, very deadly scenario that we're facing right now.
Dr. Trita Parsi, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.